So welcome to the Whisky Company Fable presentation tonight and whisky tasting. We did this one for Father's Day, so maybe you could catch up with your old man or at the other side of the country and a bit of a whisky tasting, or just as a father yourself, sit back and enjoy some whisky in the comfort of your own home. Always good to do. I've been pretty excited about this brand coming out. It's sort of something that we heard about a while ago, and we didn't see it in Australia for a long time after it was presented in the UK and in Europe, and we sort of got little hints of it here, there, and everywhere, and how good the whiskey was. We kept hearing in Europe how good the whiskey was, and then suddenly it arrived, and yeah, we certainly we've been drinking a bit of this because we have enjoyed it. It's been pretty good. So I hope tonight you're going to enjoy it as well. Tonight I'm joined by two representatives from Fable, but I'm going to introduce Kevin Griffin first. Kevin is currently in Perth, traveling about the country, telling everyone about Fable. And so he's in the good weather over in Perth at the moment. And Kevin's got a great background, first of all, in I guess bars around the country, top class whiskey bars around the country and overseas, and also been in Europe talking about Fable and presenting Fable right across Europe. So he's been doing a great job of that over there. It's really going gangbusters over in Europe at the moment. So welcome, Kevin. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Craig, and good evening to everyone who's logged on. It's great to see a few familiar names, I think, from a few previous events we've held with Craig in the past. I'm going to also introduce a colleague and a good friend of mine in Daz Haldane. Daz is part of the Fable team based out of Scotland, and we're incredibly fortunate to have a good pal work for us on Fable as well. Extensive experience across whiskey, some incredible brands. So we're really excited to kind of launch the brand virtually with you guys this evening. We've done a handful of events in Australia already, and Craig's going to be our exclusive kind of online partner for our single casks, and then quite excitingly with our blended malts, which will come hopefully this side of Christmas, all things going well. But we'll go through 5 whiskeys this evening. Myself and Daz will take you through the brand, a little bit of the creatives of how and why Fable was put together. Please, if you've got any questions, feel free to direct them through the chat box, and Craig will relay them to us. And look forward to sharing some absolutely delicious cask strength single casks with you this evening. I'll hand you over to Daz. Daz will do a little bit of intro on himself, and we'll probably get the first whiskey in our glass, enjoying it fairly quickly if you haven't done already. So
absolutely.
We'll let you know which whiskies we're going to try in which order.
Yeah, let's do that. So where we're going to start today, good evening, everyone. Good morning from Edinburgh here in Scotland. What we'll do today is we're going to start off with Mannockmore. So we're actually going to start with the last chapter in this tasting and actually work our way back. I think that's a sensible idea, being that Kalila is chapter 1, which is a lovely smoky whiskey from Islay. So chapter 5 is Mannockmore, which is a brilliant distillery, and I'll come on to Mannockmore in a wee minute, but get that in your glass and nose it, have a wee taste, get familiar with our first whiskey. And what Kev and I will do is we'll just give you a bit of an introduction to Fable, as to where it's come from, how it came about, and what we're all about as well. So what I'm going to do, actually, I'm just going to share my screen, if that's all good, just so you can see some nice visuals of Fable. You see that okay? Yeah?
Yeah.
You can see that. Lovely. Look, and what Fable is all about is capturing new imaginations. Whiskey is a great opportunity to not only share brilliant whiskey with people, of course, and drink some of the good stuff, but it's a great way of sharing stories from different parts of Scotland. And ultimately through Fable, that's what we're trying to do, is to share a fable from the southwest of Scotland, down in Dumfries, which is kind of an old tale. And this old tale has many characters within it. And it's a great thing on 2 levels. It's very visual, but it's also very emotional as well. And that's really what we're trying to bring to life. So we'd approached a lovely animation guy called Hugo Queller, and he'd heard this story for the first time and immediately was inspired by it, by the characters and by the kind of theme and the kind of ambience surrounding this story. So that's where these brilliant figures and visuals come from. They come from the story, but they also come from the slightly warped mind of Hugo Queller, the animator. And it's those animations that he's created that are across each of the chapters within Fable. So what we have across Fable is 11 chapters. Each chapter is attributed a distillery and a character. So as you navigate the products, you'll find different distilleries, different characters, and different elements of the story. This whole story takes place in a place called Clanyard Bay, which is in the very, very southwestern tip of Scotland. Kev, did you go there, Kev? Oh, you're on mute, bro.
Sorry, there we go. I never got a chance to go up when the guys captured the drone footage, unfortunately, but yeah, I do have that drone footage to show the group later on. I might do that after maybe we've had Khalil. I'll bring up the overheads. It's pretty cool. But
yeah,
but I know some of the team went quite early on.
Yeah, it's a very, very cool part of the world. And yeah, it's the really, really southern sort of western tip of Scotland, and there's a whole labyrinth of caves. And the story goes that Piper went into the caves to see fairies, to catch fairies and things, and the cliffs kind of crumbled around him. And this town, Clanyard Bay Village, it was said that the Piper's drones could be heard, through the night. And this guy obviously was stuck in there, and there's all sorts of characters and things like that come about within it. So yeah, really cool part of the world, really fascinating story, very, very visual. And that's really what we try to bring to life through these whiskies. And just on the whiskies, so my job really is to kind of put together the tasting notes, grade the casks, and make sure that we've got a really solid offering throughout the range. And there's two things here that are really important within Fable, and we're going to come on to it just now in a minute with Manic Moor, and we'll taste that and analyze what's going on there. But we think for this, it's about distillery character. All of these whiskies are matured mostly in refill hogsheads. What we're not doing is we're not layering on wine casks, we're not layering on sherry casks, rum or port or anything like that. It's all about retaining the quality of distillery character. And I think that's really interesting, actually, because these are some of what I call B-side distilleries. A lot of you, if you're into independent bottlers, you may have come across a Manic Moor or two in your time, but Manic Moor is not something you're going to see on every shelf in every specialist retailer, every shop. It's kind of lesser known distillery, let's put it that way. But I call them the sort of B-side distilleries. And that's what this is about. It's about exploring some of those distilleries that are not the obvious choices. And I think for you guys who are enjoying whiskey already, who are looking for different flavor experiences and really getting into the category, it's exactly what we're all about. And we're going to present all of these whiskies tonight at cask strength, natural color, unchill filtered, as nature intended, I suppose. So it's a really interesting way of seeing these distilleries, getting a real feel for that distillery character as you go through the different parts of Scotland, Highlands, Speyside, and across to Islay. And it's my job just to make sure that we capture those elements, that lovely bit of distillery character, good influence from American oak, refill hoggies, and making sure that, they're what we're looking for within that, because there's quality casks, and there's some of them are not always great. We get some cask samples through and we think, it's a bit edgy, maybe it needs a bit more time. Maybe this one would actually do really well with sherry. We'll park that one, or this one's an absolute banger. We definitely need to bottle that now really quickly and get it over to you guys. So that's kind of what we're looking at from a kind of whiskey choice point of view. I kind of already suggested as well that each of the distilleries within the chapters gets attributed this character as well. Here's just a quick snapshot of the 11 chapters. And we're going to try 5 of these. We're going to start at Manic Moor, and we're going to work our way back to Kalila. But there's some other great distilleries in there that I'm sure you'll get to try at another time. Places like Glenelgin, Thrusk, and Scour, some really, really great whiskies within that. And it's a nice snapshot of Scotland, going right from the Highlands all the way back through down towards Islay. And where we're going to start is chapter 5. So I'm just going to spin through here onto the tasting notes just as we start talking about chapter 5. And Has anyone tried Manic More before? Just chuck it in the comments or just pipe up. Manic More is a lesser discovered distillery. There's no doubt about that. It's actually a distillery. I used to work for Diageo a long time ago, and it was part of the Flora and Fauna collection. Some of you might be familiar with Manic More through that. But typically in the past, Manic More has just been blasted into blends. And blenders loved it for its kind of creamy and tropical fruity, slightly malty character. Those were the sort of three things that made Manic More really appealing to blenders. But I think, and I mean this in a positive way, it's a great crowd-pleasing whiskey. This is a whiskey that is really appealing on the palate. And I think to most, whatever style of whiskey you like, I've yet to meet someone that doesn't enjoy Manic More. But that doesn't mean it's not complex. It doesn't mean it's got complexity and quality. Yeah, Kev, sorry, you're going to crack on there.
No, you're good. I just wanted to add before I slip my mind, but we did the whiskey show in Melbourne a few weeks back, and Manic More was the third highest selling whiskey out of I think close to 80 products on tasting. So for a brand new brand doing its first ever event, we had 2 whiskeys in the top 10. And Manic More was, as you said, Daz, it was a real crowd pleaser. And all the single casks for Manic More have been my personal favorite. I absolutely love that flavor profile and that creaminess that you get on the palate. That you I always double take. I'm like, are we sure this is cask strength? I'm kind of double taking, because for me on the palate, it's incredibly smooth. It's got a really nice balance between that mouthfeel, that texture. A question I get asked quite a lot, Daz, which maybe you can kind of expand on, is how independent bottlers can get access to and from these distilleries, and why the distilleries don't bottle them as single malts themselves, given that they're clearly great whiskies.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, there's a strange scenario, I guess, with Diageo, and I'm not actually sure why they do this. I suspect it's to support the wider industry. To be honest, is one of the answers, I think, as to why they're supplying casks like this to us. And they've got a lot of other priorities. Let's face it, they've got big brands or aspirations for their distilleries to be big brands. Places like Singleton is a huge priority for Diageo, who's the owner of this distillery at Manic More. And then you go all the way through down to Talisker and things, and then naturally these are still blending businesses. When you look at the scale of the operation, Johnny Walker, J&B, Ballantyne's, and all that sort of stuff for the various different owners of the brands. So yeah, they will always have a little bit left, though. They'll always have something out there that they maybe just don't need, and it's a real pleasure to get our hands on some of these casks, because Manic More, as you say, creamy, buttery. It has that lovely sort of light tropical fruit, yellow fruit, kind of orangey thing coming on in the background there. It's a sensational whiskey, and a distillery actually that was built in 1971 on the old site of the Glenlossie distillery. So, it's in terms of chronologically, we're starting in the right place here. And it was an interesting time, right, for whiskey. If you think about the 1970s and what was going on, the 1960s was one of the busiest decades for single malt whiskey. Because what we saw was a lot of distilleries being built for the first time. A couple of examples would be Tam na Bhuilean, and Tom na Bhuilean, great examples of 1960s distilleries. Tom and Towel, sorry. And then the other thing that happened in the 60s was the doubling of capacity of a lot of distilleries. So there was a huge amount of increased capacity going on. Glenfiddich's a great example. Dalmore's a great example. Macallan went through a phase of growth in the 1960s and setting up for what we didn't really know what was going to happen, to be honest. But the 60s and 70s was really, really big, and blends were flying. But the big blends of the day were light, fruity blends. They weren't heavy, oily blends. J&B, Cutty Sark, were massive brands going into the 60s and into the 1970s. So Manic More, it makes sense. The style of whiskey at Manic More is fitting with what was happening in the industry at that particular time. Lighter, bit fruitier, quite a mellow, creamy sort of style. Perfect for the blenders of the day. And like I say, great whiskey. And I'm curious to see how you guys are getting on with this. Add a splash of water, as Kev says, it's cask strength. What's the age on this one, Kev? Is this 12?
So the Manic More is a 12-year-old, cask number 13783. There was 213 bottles from this cask, so 60 went AWOL somewhere. We usually average out at about 270 a cask. So approximately into Australia, we brought half of that cask of Mannockmore. So we've had about 120 bottles into Australia for the Mannockmore.
Yeah, and I think it's a great whiskey for us to start on. And typically, I mean, I do find Mannockmore, I always think of times of days, you know, what whiskies are suitable for that particular time of day. And I don't want to say it, it's not a breakfast whiskey, it's a bit heavier than that. It is a breakfast whiskey for me today, right enough, but it's a great one for early evening. I think it's got that right flavor profile exactly for kind of more aperitif sort of style, those light florals, light tropical fruits, great with a splash of water.
What always surprises me with Mannockmore, so bearing in mind it's 60% ABV. I find it quite difficult at times to pull out some really fruity flavors when the ABV is that high. I tend to get that really high volatile alcohol and then kind of just usually a greenness. But with this, it's just so tropical. You know, you start to kind of, your wine starts to wander off into like tropical fruits, that pineapple and green melon. It's great.
Yeah, no, definitely. And super highly rated as well, Kev, because the whiskies that we've got from Mannockmore have consistently been very good. And we'll talk about consistency actually as we go through these, because some of the distilleries we're getting whiskey from are not always that consistent. There's been a few where we've had rockstar casks, and there's been a couple of ones that we've actually turned down and said we can't take those. But Mannockmore's always, for me, we star grade the casks, and Mannockmore's always a 2 or a 2.5. And that's great, you know, because that means it's really consistent, really good quality all the time. And we're really liking that. Yeah, but Craig, you're absolutely right. Do add a splash of water. Let those oils jump out, give you that creamy texture, that butteriness.
It's super oily.
It is oily, yeah, no question. And it actually sits on the palate in a slightly waxy way. It's not waxy like Clynelish or Deanston, but it's kind of going in that direction for sure. Yeah.
I was at a tasting last night with Jim McEwen on there. I was telling the guys, and you know, he continually tells you to add at least 1 or 2 drops of water. Really, like he's just said there, that's just breaking those oils up in the glass, develops an aroma, and then just makes it so much easier to taste it. You know, like it does take the ABV away. Some of us like that kind of bit of spice or a bit of burn with the ABV, but you're not really tasting everything that's in that whiskey. And particularly when you're whiskey tasting and things like events like this, it's good to really have that water and add a little bit to it. But he was quite adamant last night, add a bit of water, add a bit of water. So,
look, if Jim McEwen tells you to do something, you just do it.
You do it.
You don't ask many questions.
You don't ask questions. Yeah. And I think, you know, Daz, you made a point there on how you grade the casks, you know, internally for us at Fable. It's something that I know when you're doing samples, you know, you'd usually be cutting it down, you know, with quite a bit of water, obviously, for really trying to pick out those kind of key characteristics of those casks. Yeah,
we can reduce it right down to 20%, Kev. That's really what we're looking for is to get that really reduced down. What it does is it allows us to identify some qualities, but it also allows you to identify maybe if something's not quite right. And some of those faults in whiskey can be quite ropey. They can be kind of lactic acid, butyric. You know, you can get those kind of things coming through. We've been quite lucky. The casks that we have kind of said they're not quite right. Haven't had any of those kind of faults. Haven't been issues like maybe with fermentation or anything like that. The casks just haven't performed. You know, we haven't got the oak quality from them. And that is one of the risks that you run when you're working with refill casks, is that sometimes you don't get as much oak as you would have hoped. It's a great thing, a refill cask, for like a long maturation, because when the whiskies are going up to 30 and 40-year-old, you're managing that influence really carefully. But actually, I think with refill casks, what I do love is they do allow that distillery character to sing. They really give them that kind of presence in the glass. So if we get like a good active refill, it's the perfect balance. Sometimes if they're less active, we're not getting that balance. And those are the casks sometimes that will say that's not quite right. And what's great, I mean, I was at a whiskey show just on Saturday, and we always talk about this sort of tension between, you know, when's a whiskey too young and when's it ready and things like that. And we've had some brilliant Linkwoods, some great Glenelgans that have come in at about 7 years old. They've performed brilliantly in those casks. They really, really have. And You know, it's just about the cask. They're like people, and you know, I'm one of 5 kids, so I've got 4 brothers and sisters. We're all from the same mum and dad, apparently, and you know, we're all very different from one another. You know, my brother's 6'2" with dark hair. I'm 5'6", and I'm a borderline ginger. So it's, you know, it's one of those. Whilst we can predict certain outcomes with casks, with the origin of the oak, with the way it was treated, where it was coopered, and all that kind of thing, it still does throw out. It's still nature we're dealing with, so there are still some anomalies. Yeah.
And I think early on, Daz, that was one of our driving factors behind why we really wanted to showcase this style of ex-hoggies and not doing re-racking initially. And I know early on when we first launched chapters 1 to 5 across, you know, European markets and parts of Asia, that, you know, a common feedback from a lot of people was, oh, where's the sherry? When's the sherry coming? Because it's the usual behavior, particularly obviously with indie bottlers. But I think we have then kind of now for us almost kind of segmented ourselves in this really exciting segment in single casks, because we're not hiding away anything within our whiskies. We're really highlighting that distillery character, which I think can sometimes get lost when, you know, casks are, you know, your whiskey's almost the color of a red wine and you're like, is this still Scotch? You know?
Yeah. And look, I think you're right, Kevin. It's time for that, you know, and I think what we've done here is created a range that gives people an insight into the spirit style of some of these distilleries that most people haven't tried many times. Now, if we do another Fable 2, we may choose to go with the same idea and then layer on certain cask finishes that we feel are really, really good for that particular distillery. But we wouldn't be able to do that unless we really understand the distilleries in the first place ourselves. So I think that's what we're giving ourselves the time to do, is to explore casks, understand them better, get to know what works, because there's certain distilleries here that will work with sherry. There's other distilleries here that won't work with sherry. I don't think Manickmore would be brilliant in sherry, personally. I think American oak is the perfect partner for Manickmore because of that creamy buttery, because of that slight tropical fruit note. And maybe a first fill cask will get an even richer version of that within Manickmore. A first fill bourbon barrel, go smaller, go first fill, and really emphasize that distillery style. That's where I see the opportunity with Manickmore. It might work with sherry, but my hypothesis would be go full send on American oak, and that'll be absolutely delicious.
Yeah.
So just to give those that are kind of dialed in on a bit of a background behind what our plans are with Fable. So the first installment that we have here this evening is the Ghost Piper of Clanyard Bay, and we'll run 11 characters as Daz as highlighted. We'll do that in Australia for approximately, give or take, 24 months. And then the team are already working on the next release of Fable, which will essentially be a new set of artwork, a new set of design, a new set of animation and illustration. So essentially we'll shelve the first release, which is this current one, and we'll move on to a whole new set of single casks and distilleries as well, which is super exciting, and particularly seeing some of the distilleries that are yet to come in its first drop of 11. So we're really excited to obviously launch chapters 1 through to 11 first, but we'll very quickly after that be following with almost a completely new brand under the Fable kind of umbrella, which is super exciting. Keeps it interesting. It keeps everyone engaged. I think, you know, Daz and I have worked with some incredible whiskey brands that, you know, it's great and super exciting, but things can get a little bit repetitive. That's definitely not going to happen with Fable.
No, but exactly that. And I think with this range as well, we go from Manickmore, which is in the kind of north part of Speyside, up towards Forest. So it's right in the kind of northern tip, if you like, of the Speyside region. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to go back into the heart of Speyside, about 20 miles south in a straight line pretty much, to very close to Aberlour. You would actually drive through Craigellachie, where Macallan and Craigellachie Distillery are. You then go all the way down to Aberlour, where Aberlour Distillery is, of course. You would actually just keep going towards Glenallachie. And after that, you hang a left and you get down to the Benrinnes distillery, which is going to be our second whiskey of the evening. And Benrinnes is so different to Manickmore, so different. What I really recommend that you do as we go through the tasting is, if you have enough glasses, is keep a little bit of each of these whiskies in the glass so we can go back and forward and just kind of reference where we're at. And I think one of the things that I'm conscious of is that when we talk about Scotch, historically, we did always talk about regions. It was a very simple way of roughly communicating a style. Speyside is apple pear flavors, orchard fruits, you know, quite easygoing and mellow. Highlands were a bit spicier, a bit heavier, sometimes smoky. Isla, always smoky, you know, and lowlands were grassy and floral. As a rule, that was okay, but what you start doing is you start going distillery by distillery in these regions. What you start to realize is actually there are massive differences between some of the Speyside distilleries. Bunnahabhain is not peated as standard, you know, nor is Bruichladdich. So you start going around and going, okay, there are some quirks within this, but it's a good guide regionally. It's helpful. But when you start going into the detail of it, actually, you start to see there's smoky whiskies in Speyside, there's unpeated whiskies on Isla, you know, there's a whole combination of things going on. Now, Benrinnes is a good example of this, I think, because Benrinnes is not a pushover of a whiskey. I talked about Manickmore being appealing, it's a bit of a crowd pleaser, and it is in many ways. Benrinnes is definitely a heavy Speyside single malt whiskey. It's got quite a meaty quality, it's got quite a nutty style, and it's very, very malty. Yeah. And I love that about Benrinnes. And it's a really robust single malt whiskey. And this is the kind of whiskey you could go and put a first fill sherry cask, age it for 20 years, and you'll still get that spirit character coming through, because it's got big shoulders, this whiskey. And it's one that I think is divisive. I don't think everyone loves Benrinnes. I think a lot of people haven't tried Benrinnes, to be fair. But I like the style. It's a really nice one to move on to as we progress from Manickmore down to Benrinnes in the heart of Speyside.
Yeah, perfect. I think, you know, the two key common flavor profiles that you've already highlighted has been the that meatiness and that sulfur kind of heaviness on the palate. I think it was a very common piece of feedback on any whiskey shows that we did recently in Australia and across Europe, was that around the Benrinnes, which is great because, as you said, they're within the same region of Speyside or different locations, but stylistically they couldn't be any different. So great for blenders, but great to get your hands on some great single casks of Benrinnes. Big character on this one, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. So where like Benrinnes is, like I say, it is in the heart of Speyside. Benrinnes takes its name from the mountain. It's the mountain that looks over the sort of Spey Valley, if you like. From the top of the distillery, from the mountain, you'll probably be able to see around 15 distilleries, something like that. Yeah.
And cask is 301911. On this one here as well.
What age have we got on this one, Kev? What ABV have you guys got?
12.
12.
Yeah,
perfect,
so 60.2 ABV, so it's punchy. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. Again, Craig, I know when we did a very early kind of sweet sample with you, I think the Benrinnes was one that you were kind of like, yeah, it was a particular style that you knew would go well with your drinkers.
I thought it was good because, yeah, it's got lots of, like somebody just said, they are malty, very malty. And that's kind of the first thing you get. And I think that's what a lot of people look for. It's like a traditional style of whiskey. At the start, you start to nose it, and then when you taste it, it's sort of giving you these big, bold flavors. And, you know, like this, again, water in it just mellows them out, makes you like just taste more of those flavors, and more distinctive with the water. And the finish is just like this beautiful, like it's not hugely long, but it's nice and medium. And I think with this whiskey, that medium finish kind of says, well, I need to drink that again, you know, like, because I need that flavor again. Whereas long finishes, you tend to go, I'll just sit on this for a while, you know. But this is not one of those whiskeys. It's one that you just kind of keep pouring, and then kind of understand that you've went through a quarter of a bottle and I didn't realize it because it was just so nice, you know. And each glass is a bigger glass. But yeah, very, very good. Yeah, like, and there's a lot of Benrinnes casks out there. There's a lot. I mean, it's one distillery that we see a lot of, but I think we were just talking there about Fable being a brand, and I think the brand that it's become is that you want confidence in a brand now. You like, and somebody in the chat just said about Carnmore, and it's recently I was having some Carnmore, and I've been put off by Carnmore because I kept getting stuff that was quite warm and spicy, and I just like, oh, it's just not for me. So then I've came away from it altogether, and I'm sort of like, oh, I should probably go back again, but because I've sort of got no confidence in it now. Whereas with the Fable brand, I seem to have a lot of confidence in what they're doing. You know, like everything's very drinkable and lots of flavor and really distinctive distillery flavors, which is great.
Yeah, and I think that's what you need to do with Benrinnes, is let that distillery style really come through, that maltiness, that spiciness.
Yep.
Okay, I see Thomas there, and I agree, Jason, that the meatiness is definitely there. If you remember, I mean, you go back in time a little bit, but the Benrinnes distillery, and get a sense again as to where it's come from. Big blenders malt. It was owned by Dewar's for a long time, and then it moved over to United Distillers, became Diageo, and it's kind of sat within their sort of stock for a wee while. It was actually triple distillation up until 2007, the Benrinnes distillery. So it has again adapted its style to meet the needs of the blends. And at that time, that sort of triple distillation would have been similar to the sort of process at Mortlach. It wasn't quite a full triple distillation. It was like a 2.8 distillation. So aiming for that meaty quality, that heavier style. So blenders really liked it for that. And you can see why. They then went back to double distillation after that. They refurbished the distillery again in 2007, 2008. And then went back with a sort of double distillation, sort of more classic setup in the still house. One of the things they kept though, which was great, and it's why we get the style of whiskey we get, is worm tub condensers. So at the back of the stills, the spirit stills, you've got the copper coil condensers, which are bathed in water. And you can manipulate that water. You can make it warm and you can make it cold, depending on what kind of sort of spirit style you want. And that's what they've got here at Benrinnes is these lovely warm tubs, which allow you to capture that slightly heavier, slightly meatier spirit style. So that's it. Yeah. So yeah, and Jason. Good.
Sorry to interrupt you, Daz. Will they change that condenser style kind of regularly to kind of impact what different styles of Benrinnes that they're kind of making, or will they keep it relatively consistent?
They'll keep it consistent, definitely. It does allow for experimentation, but big business that own this distillery, of course, Diageo, they're looking for consistency. What happens a lot though, Kev, is a lot of distilleries will run a program before shutdown. Every year we shut the distilleries for around 6 weeks, and that allows us to tidy things up, repaint things, fix things, and all that sort of thing. And usually that's when we would run a separate program. So a lot of distilleries that don't normally make smoky whiskey would make smoky whiskey just before shutdown or just after shutdown. They may do other experiments, and they might do things like that. They might isolate stills. They might run a slightly different campaign and go for a heavy spirit rather than a light spirit if they need that for blending purposes. So if they do that, they'll do it at that time, and they'll do it for a short period, and then they'll get back to doing the kind of day job, if you like. Yeah. So
there's a great question in the chat box, as I'll get you to answer it just before we move to the next one, because I think it's right on point what you're chatting about now. Just from Jason, can we explain double and triple distillation and what are the advantages and disadvantages? I think it's a brilliant question, and probably not something that a lot of people would ask. They would just accept double distillation, triple, and not really kind of dive too much into the whys and what it results in.
Yeah. We used to always joke, right? So the Irish distillers quite often use triple distillation as their sort of standard technique. And in Scotland, typically it's double distillation. So we use 2 stills and we increase the concentration of the alcohol twice. Whereas in Ireland, typically for malts, they would maybe do it 3 times. So we used to always joke and say the Irish, it takes them 3 times to get it right, and it only takes us 2. And that's, it's a very loose way of explaining things, I suppose. But what actually you're doing with triple distillation is you're creating a cleaner spirit. You're increasing the spirit concentration to a higher level, and therefore removing more impurities through triple distillation. Scotch distillers, there are a couple that have done this. There's actually a lot of distilleries that have triple distilled in the past, and Benrinnes being one. Talked a little bit about Mortlach having what a still called the Wee Witchy, where they almost triple distill, and Auchentoshan down in the lowlands is a triple distilled single malt. Another distillery up until the 60s was Talisker, used to be triple distilled up until it burnt down in the 1960s. So a lot of distilleries used to use this triple distillation technique in Scotland to create a lighter style of spirit. And double distillation typically would give you a slightly heavier style. There are so many variables though, Jason, within that. If you've got big stills, you can create a lighter spirit. If you warm up that water in the worm tub condensers at the back, you can really help create that much lighter spirit as well. So there are lots of elements that can contribute to it, but one of the major benefits of triple distillation are getting that lighter, more easygoing spirit style. But you can lose flavor too through doing that. So that is one of the disadvantages of triple distillation.
Understand as there are a few distilleries out there that like partially triple distill, so they go 2.5 times. Are there any Diageo distilleries that do that? Or
yeah, Mortlach. Yep. Yep, Mortlach is one. This distillery was until 2007. Yeah, so it's definitely exactly. Yeah, Thomas, you're right. So Glenmorangie is a great example of that. They've got the tallest stills in the industry in Scotland. So they do make a very, very light style. They talk about their stills as giraffe neck stills. So they get lots and lots and lots of copper contact as the spirit tries to make its way up to the top before it passes over. So yeah, absolutely.
Comparing that to the other end of the scale where you'd get small little dumpy kind of small kettle kind of shaped stills, that would create obviously a lot more of a meatier, heavier style naturally.
Yeah, definitely. So at Macallan, when I worked there, we had the smallest stills in Speyside at the time, spirit stills. So that was exactly for that. We wanted a heavy, heavy single malt, almost sulfury. And the reason for that was that sulfur note would actually mellow with time, which made Macallan a really useful spirit style for long maturation, and it does age very well. I also worked at Dalmore, and Dalmore was very similar, but in different ways. We created quite a heavy malty spirit at Dalmore, and Dalmore was great for long maturations, but it also had the shoulders on it to sort of compete with wine casks and port pipes and big sweet sherry cask PXs and stuff like that. So it is all dependent on what you want, basically. If you want that heavy style of spirit for long maturations across different casks, then you small stills or stills that can help create, and there's loads of ways you can do it, but small stills are a really good way of doing it.
Yeah, awesome. And it's probably not something usually, I suppose, as independent bottlers we talk about in detail, because obviously we don't control that element of what distilleries do, but we definitely identify within the distilleries that we kind of acquire casks from, that their key characteristics, so we know how to treat those casks. And that's what you guys do in Scotland. Yeah,
and Kev, we get excited by that. I do. Like every time we get one of these samples coming through, we get a little batch of maybe 10 cask samples, and we look at them and go, brilliant. Are we going to see the distillery character here? Like, what are we going to get? Are we going to get that nutty, fruity? Are we going to get this meaty, malty combination? Because not only are we making single casks, single cask bottlings, but we're also blending malts as well. Right, so we're quite keen to see what we've got to play with at the same time. So it's there. I genuinely, it's the thing that excites me the most. I think I would be less excited if they had come in with sherry influence and wine influence and things like that, because I'd be quite happy to sit and drink those, definitely. But for what we're trying to do here, I think it's different. And yes, we do look forward to getting those samples coming through for that reason.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you remember that Rogue cask that I got bottled for Belgium, but it was, I think, Glen Elgin or Glen Spey, and we were told, yeah, it's ex-Hoggies, and it was like, we like feed them back to it. Are you sure? It's like really, really dark.
We've had a couple, we have had a couple. I mean, we were drinking a Linkwood a couple of weeks ago, which had come through really dark, really unusual for refill hogshead. And it was mad. And there's a few examples of that. Blair Athol actually seems to come through quite a lot darker regularly at the moment. And I know that 10, 12 years ago, there was an issue with bourbon cask supply. So a lot of companies were going to France and buying wine casks because we needed something to fill. And I wonder if it's some of that coming through the system now, you know, just over time, it's started to sort of ease in, and they've been labeled as refill, but they haven't been identified as wine origin casks, you know.
Which makes it exciting for us as a whiskey company, right? Like a part of my message that I say to consumers every time I'm out doing tastings is that we literally taste every single Fable that has been bottled. Excuse me. Like we taste as a team, and Daz and the team in Scotland don't bottle and pull something from a cask if we're not 100% happy with it, which is great. It's a great process still to have.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Well, look, let's move on to our third whiskey. We're not traveling very far. We're only going a couple of miles from Ben Rinnes across to Dalhousie. Now, Dalhousie, again, another distillery that has contributed most of its malt over the years to blends. And it has a slight savoury twist to it as well. And I think moving on from Ben Rinnes, it'll be interesting just to see how you guys find Dalhousie and see what subtle differences there are. And it's a whiskey that I, again, going back to kind of my first memories of Manickmore, similar with Dalhousie, my first memories of Dalhousie were from the Flora and Fauna collection. And I think it was a 14-year-old that was released in Flora and Fauna. And I always remember it having these lovely tobacco-y kind of heavier notes. And in Flora and Fauna, I think it was sherry cask matured, or partly sherry cask matured, and it had this lovely dark richness to it. And that's where I think we're going with Dalhousie is into the slightly richer, slightly heavier style of single malt again. Quite fruity. Thomas, I might be pronouncing it wrong, to be honest. I wouldn't take my word for it. I'm from an area of Scotland called Fife, and we don't say anything right, so it could be me saying it wrong. Don't worry. Craig's laughing, and he's in full support of that.
Yeah. We usually have to get a visa for Daz to travel out of the border from Scotland. But it's a great distillery. It's one that I think when we talk about single cask, Daz, we can always get very fixated on obviously the flavor profile and the aroma. I think one for me with the Dalhousie is has a beautiful texture and sort of viscosity on the palate. Which obviously is a key component that blenders will look for. But for me, it's got such a great weight on the palate. This particular cask, we bottled at 11 years old. There was 275 bottles in total, and it was distilled on the 14th of the 7th, 2010.
Yeah, and it's a distillery that's actually closed at the moment. It's been closed for 2 years, and I'm not sure when it's due to reopen and start production. But I've got a good friend of mine, actually, who's a guy from the whiskey industry, a guy called Mitch Beshard, and he actually bought the old excise officer's house at the Dalhousie distillery, which is quite cool. Many years ago, a taxman used to live on site at every distillery to measure the amount of alcohol that was being produced so that we would pay the right amount of tax. And of course, for many, many years, we tried to avoid paying that tax at every distillery in Scotland as best we could. And the only way really to manage it properly was to have someone on site. Quite often, that tax guy, the excise man, would themselves become corrupted because the stillmen and the managers of the distillery would keep a healthy flow of spirit going into that house or going into the pockets of the excise man. So they were easily persuaded at times, shall we say, to turn a blind eye to some of the goings on at the distilleries. And it's quite funny because this place is called Copper Brock, and it's, like I say, it's where the excise officer lived at Dalhousie, and we've managed to find some of the old bits and pieces from the various excise officers that lived on site at the distillery. So it's been quite nice to get a little bit closer to Dalhousie and to get a little bit closer to the sort of people that lived at this distillery over the years. Because as I say, it's closed at the moment. But we're still really lucky getting some of these casks coming through because it's a distillery I really like the quality of. I like the mouthfeel. I'm a big one for texture. And we don't often talk about texture in whiskey. We always talk about aroma. We always talk about flavor. And I think it's a massive miss if we don't talk about texture, because as you move around the various distilleries, we're seeing this in the 3 that we've tried already. There is a distinct difference in texture and mouthfeel as we move around these distilleries.
And Daz, I'm right in reading, I remember reading a stat regarding the overall malt production on Dalyuan. It's something like only 3% of their overall production gets kept back and bottled as single malt and single casks.
Yeah, that feels about right. Yeah,
which is incredible when you think of the output that a distillery like Dalyuan has.
Yeah. I don't know what the output is. We might have it on the screen. It's probably 4 or 5 million litres a year. It's a decent sized distillery. It's not a small distillery, and exactly that. You can imagine how much of that's been contributed to blending, and it's why these distilleries are here. It's great that we now have the opportunity to sample them and try them. But the only reason they're here is to supply these blends at the moment. Now, it'll be interesting to see how that will change in the future. You know, will a company like Diageo identify 3 or 4 of these lesser known distilleries and go, right, we're going to back these as single malt whiskey brands because of the style and the quality and the stocks that they have available to them. But I hope not. I hope they don't do that to all of them, because we still get a couple of these little gems here hiding away. And what's the age on our cask here? Is it a 12-year-old again, Kev?
So the Dalyuan is 11 years old, and a slight reduction in ABV to 59.4.
Okay, so we're still going to probably add a splash of water, and I think what you'll see is a little bit of that spiciness coming through in Dalyuan. You might get a little bit of sweet licorice. You might get a little bit of that sort of fresh ginger, a little bit of heat there as well. Just add that splash. See how it opens up and see how it develops. I think there's less sweet notes in this, like less obvious sweetness. You get a little bit of, like I said, savoury, but you're not getting what we got in Manickmore, where it was quite honeyed. You know, that lovely tropical fruit note, lots of vanillas and creams and butters and things like that coming through. This is more like definitely spice, grassy notes, herbal, savoury, those kind of qualities coming through.
Yeah, and there's just a good question in here, Daz, as well, around the kind of some of the main characteristics or differences around French oak and American oak.
Right.
Obviously something that we could probably do a whole separate evening on that as a subject, because it is fascinating. But as a rule of thumb, obviously the differences with first fill French oak, let's say, for example, and first fill American oak. Can you give us just a bit of an oversight on the flavor profiles that we'll get from those 2 different oaks?
Yeah. So American oak is Quercus alba. So usually comes from the Ozark Mountains. So you're in the kind of Missouri area of the States. What you do is American oak there is great. It's got lots of space. So it doesn't compete for light as much as it would necessarily in Europe. The trees grow faster. The trees in America grow in about 70 years before we would harvest them and chop them down and turn them into casks. So Ranjan, you're absolutely right. You get more staves from American oak than you do from European oak. And the reason for that is that it doesn't compete for light. So American oak grows straight and true like Americans, okay? And in Europe, it's a bit more kind of like that, it grows. So you do end up with more kinks and quirks and things like that in the oak, which limits your ability to produce as many staves. Now, if we come over to Europe, there's a few elements to consider here. In the north of Spain, in Cantabria and Galicia, we would take Quercus robur, and that's the sherry oak that people think of when they think of really dark whiskies, really heavy, rich, spicy whiskies. Now, Quercus robur is really difficult to work with. You're not allowed to cut down that many trees, but it's great for flavour and sort of colour. The issue you have with those species of oak in the north of Spain is that the sherry bodegas don't like using it because it's not that reliable for the way that they mature their sherry in a Solera system. They much prefer American oak. So years ago, I used to go over to Jerez a lot and work with the bodegas and things. And I used to go over with a guy called Stuart McPherson, who was the master of wood over at Edrington, Macallan and Highland Park. So we used to go over to the cooperages, and then we would go down to the bodegas. And it was always a struggle to get them to fill Spanish oak. But it's great for colour, and it gives you a lot of quality in a short period of time if you can get your hands on it. But you have to pay more for it. Yeah. When you go over the Pyrenees and into France, you do get some of this Quercus robur, but then you start to move into Quercus petrea. And Quercus petrea is the kind of halfway house between the Spanish oak and the American oak. And and tannins wise, it's about half the tannins of Spanish oak, but it's about twice the tannins of American oak. But you get buttery, creamy qualities, you get nice spice notes, but you get a lot of vanilla and you get a lot of orange, which is kind of what you expect sometimes from American oak. It's a richer version, if you like, of American oak. And you do get fewer staves per trunk, if you like, Ranjan, you're right. But it's a highly reliable cask and it's great quality as you move across Europe. You go over to Hungary and Romania, where we still get some of these Quercus roburs coming through, Quercus Petrea, coming through. And actually the variance is not that much. It's quite similar to French oak, just getting it from different places. Still super high quality from Romania and Hungary. So that's the kind of American oak, vanillas, oranges, gingers, coconuts. Over to Spain, super rich, big spice, really dark fruits and stoned fruits and things. And then we go back into Europe, into France and across to Romania and Hungary, and we get more of that kind of middle ground between those two oak species. So yeah, what happens though is when you order European oak, you don't know what you're getting. So sometimes you're getting Quercus robur, but sometimes you're getting wood from France and wood from further east. And that's where you need to manage your cask policy really carefully and just be on them, audit it, make sure they're toasting things properly, make sure they're looking after the wood properly with wine, not filling it with water, just to keep it airtight and things. So there's a few shortcuts some of the guys will use to look after the wood and to probably save costs as well. So yeah, it's a big old category, and you're right, Kev, you could do a whole session on oak, charring, toasting, and all of that. So yeah, Jason, you're right. 95% of the oak in the sherry industry is American oak. And that goes back a long way. And they like it because it's reliable. They like it because it doesn't impart huge amounts of flavor onto the wines, because it's a mellower, it's got less tannins in it than the European oaks do. So they really like American oak.
Yeah, and it's cheaper naturally, obviously, than French oak and Spanish oak.
Cheaper.
Yeah,
Definitely cheaper. Yeah.
If ever in doubt, just think economical.
Yeah, definitely. And that's right, Jason. I love sherry cask matured whiskies. I think what people think is that it's always European oak. It's not. Quite often it's American oak. Certain distilleries will ask for European oak, and certain distilleries are actually buying the oak at source and then getting that through the sawmills, getting that through the coopers, and then getting that through the sherry bodegas. It then makes its 3-week trip back up to Scotland. So yeah, one for a different session, probably, to be honest. I mean, we could go into this in great depth, but we're not using sherry casks at all for Fable. What we're using here is refill hogsheads. Sometimes there's a few sneaky ones that get in there, a few wine casks that for whatever reason have ended up in our inventory, but it's mostly American oak, ex-bourbon, and then we've turned it into a hogshead probably as well.
Are there any good videos, Daz, about telling you about Spanish oak or American oak that you know of, or websites you can go to? Do you know?
Yeah, definitely. Look, the guys that are closest to this are Edrington, who own Macallan and Highland Park. They are definitely the closest to it. So if you were to type in Stuart McPherson, Master of Wood at Macallan, and there'll be a video on YouTube that will come up where he's explaining the full process. Great guy. Yeah.
And again, like we've not dived into that subject as much as we could, but I think it's important to kind of factor, same with anything around still shapes and sizes and age profile. There's so many variables that different distilleries can factor in as well, which what makes then single malt so complex and so different, which is really exciting for us when we're dealing with single casks, because even when we've got a suite of single casks, Daz, from the same distilleries, there's a lot of complexities, a lot of differences usually, because the casks can be so different sometimes, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so that's us. We've had a wee spin through Mannockmore. We've headed south into the middle of Speyside through Benrinnes, and then across the road, really, a couple of miles down to the Dal distillery. Where's next, Kev? Where should we go?
Well, it's Linkwood and Colilla left as part of the tasting. I think obviously Linkwood's that little bit more gentle and lighter than the beautiful Colillas that we have. So let's go to the Linkwood next, which is a 12-year-old single cask, 58.7% ABV. And there was 277 bottles from this particular cask. And yeah, I mean, we always get quite excited by our Linkwoods because we've actually bottled, I think our youngest whiskey to date that we bottled in the UK market and also in Denmark was a 7-year-old Linkwood. And we dropped a few samples into some very well-known and established whiskey bars and retailers down south in London. And I know the Linkwood 7 was really highly regarded. So for us, that was enough reason in itself to have confidence to bottle it. You know, I think, as we don't touch on it a huge amount in tastings because a lot of the time for us, quite fortunately, the quality of our spirits we don't talk about age profile as much. You know, I think I've only had the question once, you know, recently of, oh, when are we getting 18-year-old whiskeys? When will we do this? And for us, it's great to be able to actually showcase across our range. I think we've done almost every year from 7 right up to 14, which is quite a nice variety.
Yeah, definitely, and it allows us to retain that distillery character, and that's the aim here. And we may do some older ones, I guess, for what comes next, Kev. It's interesting, actually, just as you were chatting there, you've got 2 whiskies left. You have Linkwood and you have Kalila. Flavor-wise, very different. What I would say, though, the consistency between the 2 distilleries is their elegance. I always find Linkwood and Kalila very elegant single malt whiskies, probably for different reasons. But Linkwood is floral. It has this lovely grassy quality. And I love the flavors of tea, the elegance of tea and the subtleness of teas. And I always find a little note of that in Linkwood. It's a little bit of kind of Assam, slight fruity, and even into Earl Grey, where you've got that lightly floral kind of style. And those are flavors I absolutely adore. And I always do find them in Linkwood. And add a splash of water and just see how some of these lighter notes, these more subtle notes come through. And it's just such an intriguing distillery. And it has a bit of a cult following, Linkwood. There's a lot of people I speak to who are really into it, you know, and they go around all the independent bottlers and the few proprietary bottlings that are out there, and they source them and they like tasting them next to each other and they really go for it. You know, they're kind of like hardcore fans of Linkwood. And it's great because it's not the obvious choice. It's not big and bold and brash. Very subtle, very elegant. And
it's a great point you made because when we've done tastings of it recently, it's that Mr. Consistent among a lineup, but people love the range of Linkwoods because I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Linkwood's one of those distilleries where it's great at a young age, but also holds up really, really well as it gets older. So it's it's the best of both worlds because I think it has that really bright floral butterscotch creaminess, but then it has this really clean, elegant style as a house style, and it's just it really is a beautiful single malt.
It's the one, Kev. You're right. It's the one that's got the most. It's the one that we've regularly scored the highest. Every cask that we've had of Linkwood, I've scored as a 3-star. It's rocking. It's always good. Always very good. And it's kind of a. I'm not sure if it's my bias towards Linkwood. I do know what I'm tasting. I'm not doing it blind, so it's one of those. I'm probably like, it's a Linkwood. I'm like marking it up like my own child. Do you know what I mean? It's like, Everyone always asks me, how good's your son at football? Oh, he's fantastic, absolutely brilliant, best player in his class. He's useless, he's terrible, but it's just my skewed view of the world, and it's maybe a bit like that with Linkwood.
Brilliant.
But it's those subtleties. Add a bit of water, let those little things jump out. Fresh mint, green teas, herbal notes, even sage, slightly softer, you know, really, really beautiful whiskey. One that I always look forward to sort of trying, and it is one of those perfect time of day for me. Actually, it's a lunchtime whiskey.
It has this kind of, for me, like it reminds me straight off the bat of macadamia nuts, and it has that kind of like creamy nuttiness, but then it has that brightness to it as well. I absolutely love the Linkwood. I think it's really, really delicious. I think it's got that really nice kind of clean green fruits coming off that back palate as you swallow, as you finish. And
it does have that toffee apple quality, and that is a I mean, a classic Speyside tasting note, isn't it? Is like that softer oak note with the distillery character coming through from the apple and pear sort of qualities coming together. And yeah, it does have that toffee apples, but there's a lot of depth to that, a lot of elegance. Nice. Well, I hope you've had a chance to kind of go back and forward as well and just sort of reference these. So, you know, go back to the Benrinnes and sit it next to the Linkwood just to see and highlight those differences between that lighter style versus that maltier, meatier style. I think Dal Ewan as well, back to Manickmore is a good one. Again, just sort of savoury style Dal Ewan, whereas you've got that freshness and vibrancy in the Manickmore. And that's what this is all about. And that's what we're trying to do here is to highlight the distillery characters, to show you those differences and not absolutely hammer these whiskies with oak. It's about balance and it's about letting that distillery character really, really shine. And if we move to kind of our last whiskey, we can do that now, I think, and enjoy your Linkwood, but pour your Caol Ila. And again, go back and forward between these. And I think Caol Ila is a distillery that everyone's always excited to try. Islay distilleries as well. I mean, they're always fascinating. Smoke is a bit of a mythical beast. People are always keen to understand where that smokiness comes from, what's it like, how does it portray itself, and I'm not a massive smoke head, I don't think. I mean, I like smoky whiskies, but I don't always reach for Islay or smoky whiskies particularly. But what I do love when I do explore smoky whiskies is it smoky or is it peaty? Because I do think they're two different things. You know, when you think of smoke, you're thinking of the burning embers. You know, you're thinking of all the things that you do at home that create smoke. You know, maple, charcoal,
char, that kind of burnt char.
Yeah, that char, that edge of your bacon fat, that caramelization of fats and things. There's a brilliant smoky, meaty kind of quality. You guys probably don't need your fires in your houses over there. But when we burn a fire here in Scotland, you've got that kind of damp ash, that kind of spent fire, which is a really different type of aroma to, you know, burning oak, burning smoke, wood smoke. And we go through that whole range of flavors and characters within smokes. Does it get cold in Canberra? I'll take your word for it, Jason. Yeah.
Well, we'll need to get you over next year, Daz, because you know, we've just come out of winter, but it's certainly peak whiskey drinking time in Australia, particularly obviously Canberra. It does get very cold and parts of Melbourne, obviously, but it's great because you usually just kind of think, obviously, when we're in the UK, we think of Australia as just being a hot climate. So I was always quite intrigued of, well, when do people drink their whiskey if it's always warm outside? And I actually don't see people's trends in whiskey change too much throughout the year. Obviously, I think as it gets colder, they might get more of those kind of heavier, peatier, smoky whiskeys coming out. But we'll need to get you over to do a tasting with us in person next year. Let's try and make that happen.
I look forward to that. Yeah. I've not been over for a long time. It's 20 years actually since I was last in Australia. But yeah, we'll definitely. Is
your banning order released? Have they?
It will be actually. Yeah. Just be lifted, mate. Yeah. I'm sure I'll find something else to get kicked out for though. Yeah.
But I've always loved when we've done tastings on the Caol Ila, how you describe that elegance around Caol Ila, because when I talk in that same way about Caol Ila, it's not a descriptive word that people would expect with a peated whiskey from Islay. You know, they expect just that kind of harsh, smack in the face smoke, whereas actually we love that youthfulness, that fresh, green, kind of fruity characters which come through a lot of our Caol Ilas. And I think the balance between that fruity malt and that smokiness is absolutely brilliant when you get that balance right.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt. And we're talking about sort of smoke flavors, and then we go into that mossy, peaty kind of aroma. We don't really get that in Caol Ila. You get that in Lefroy. You get that weight of the almost like damp peat smoke in Lefroy, which is delicious, but it's very different. You see it a little bit in Springbank as well, that kind of oily, heavy smoke, almost fusel oils at times, but none of that exists in Caol Ila. I'll tell you a couple of things about Caol Ila that are really interesting. Well, one is that the stills are massive. They've got really tall stills. I think they're the third or fourth tallest stills in single malt. So that's where the elegance comes from. It's where the clean style of spirit comes from. And this might surprise a few people. I don't know how many of you are big Lagavulin fans, but Lagavulin's a very different beast to Caol Ila. It's almost like it's muscly big brother, right? Lagavulin's heavy, rich. It's like a big, meaty kind of single malt whiskey. It's exactly the same malted barley that goes to Caol Ila that goes to Lagavulin. It's just what they do at the distillery that's different. So this exactly the same raw material, same specification of malt. And that's so fascinating. It just shows you the influence that the distillation process and everything that kind of happens in the distillery has on the final product. And Caol Ila has always been my preference from Islay. It's always been my preference because I like the cleanness. I like the softer notes. And it's like you say, Kev, when you get that right with the wood, get some of that honey, that little sweet orange, little bits like that coming through. Caol Ila is just a consistently brilliant whiskey. It always is. And I say that for what we've got with Fable. I think this one in particular has got a little bit of a richer quality to it than you would usually get from a standard Caol Ila. It's a bit heavier. It's a bit fuller flavored than standard Caol Ila. That's released by Diageo, or even that you find in maybe some of the other independent bottlers. It's usually quite pale. It's usually quite light. I think this is a good one. It's got that honey note, that little bit of extra influence from what is an active refill cask.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with the Caol Ilas, it's always great because we've talked about it obviously throughout the session, how complex and how different distilleries can be, but there's so many aspects of the process that are very, very similar, if not the same. So the differences between Caol Ila and a Lagavulin is literally just doing what they're doing in the stills and how different the stills are. And obviously, I don't know if a lot of people in the group have tried some of the younger Lagavulins or the younger Caol Ilas, but it maybe highlights some of the flavors that we're talking about from that young, bright, honeyed green fruit element that we're getting in some of these Caol Ilas. It's beautiful.
Yeah, and I love young Caol Ila, 8 years old and things. It's great. Like, I don't like young Lagavulin at all. I remember the 8-year-old they did. It was one of the special releases, and that was at one of the one of the whiskey dinner things. And the distillery manager had brought a bottle of Lagavulin 8-year-old for the table, and I said to him, I was like, mate,
what Caol Ila is that you're holding up, Thomas? Oh yeah, Gordon MacPhail. Yeah. You're on mute. Oh, I can't hear him.
Yeah, just take yourself off mute, Tom.
Yeah, it's the 9-year-old, and it's actually much more lemony and quite sharp compared to yours. Yours is actually much more rounded, has more honey to it. This one's like a stiletto, and yours is more a very nice sort of carving knife.
Yeah, nice.
It
is a bit richer.
Yeah.
It is a bit richer, Thomas, than normal, I would say, this one. And I found that actually we've had a few casks recently from Caol Ila. I'm quite surprised at how well the casks have performed, because usually when you get Caol Ila, it's all about the kind of spirit style, less about the oak, and it's usually very pale. And these are coming through quite golden. They're coming through with a little bit of that lovely oaky influence. And actually they're very, very well balanced Caol Ilas, which is different usually from what I'm used to from Caol Ila. And I'm really enjoying them.
There's a startling variety. I have a lot of Caol Ila. There's a startling variety, given it's that single distillery, lots of independent bottlers using it, and it's different in every one.
Yeah. What's interesting, they've actually just refurbished it. So they reopened last week. So you never used to be able to visit Caol Ila. And it's a real shame, because it's the most beautiful location for any distillery. It's in Port Ascaig. So Port Ascaig is the kind of eastern tip of Islay. And Caol Ila literally means the sound of Islay. So it's the bit of water between Islay and Jura. So when you stand in the stillhouse at Caol Ila, you look over the paps of Jura, over the sound of Islay, and it's usually where all the ferry crossings are between Islay and Jura. So it's a really, really stunning location. But they've just refurbished the distillery, so you never used to be able to visit it, but now it has a visitor centre. So if any of you guys have got plans to head over to Islay, you can add Caol Ila to your visits list, because you can now get in and have a good look around. And actually, it's a distillery that was refurbished in the 1970s. Maybe slightly unsympathetically, if you like, Clynelish was the same, done by the same architect at the same time. And they put these big glass boxes around the still houses, and they kind of look like a big giant community centre. You know, they're not the most beautiful looking buildings, but they've kind of, there's a charm to them. There's a bit of a utilitarian vibe to Caol Ila and Clynelish, which is quite endearing. But inside those big glass boxes are the still houses. And it's great that they are glass, because it means that you've got full views right over onto Jura. So yeah, really beautiful part of the world, insane views, and a distillery now that you can visit, which is great.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's more exciting stuff to come from obviously what we're releasing later in the year with the remaining chapters 6 through to 11. I'm sure we'll get back on with Craig, obviously, into you know, the rest of the distilleries. But I think it's great, Daz, to be able to get you online and kind of go through some of the other stories and tales that we can share on whiskey, because I think one of the most exciting aspects for me with Fable is, you know, we don't have to rehash and regurgitate the same brand story that's been created in a marketing office. And we can literally just kind of talk about the whiskeys, talk about the distilleries, but from a very independent aspect, you know, and just talking about whiskey in a different way. So it's great to be able to share that with the group this evening.
Yeah, no, it's been a real pleasure. It's been great to see the tasting notes, and clearly an understanding as well of where we are and what we're trying to achieve with these single malts. And it's fascinating just to hear about some people's sort of interests as well. Thomas, there with your Caol Ilas, and you've tried a lot of those, and it's great to hear your views on what you think of Fable, because we're still quite new. I mean, we only started this in June last year. So, you know, feedback on the whiskies is something that, still quite new to us. You know, we have a view, we have an opinion, but it doesn't really matter until people like yourselves are tasting them and sharing your tasting notes. It's, you know, it reaffirms and gives us a different perspective as well on how these whiskies are. So yeah, much appreciated. I'm glad you've got to try them. I hope you've enjoyed them. And thanks very much for the opportunity to have me on and talk you through the Fable whiskies.
Yeah, brilliant. And it's great to be able to launch it with Craig and his team. You know, the majority of Australia's allocation is going to be with Craig, and then I'll work with Craig and his team, and it's in some of the best kind of whiskey bars across the country and some amazing restaurants. But I think it's great for us as Fable to be able to bring over, you know, we're not talking about thousands and thousands and shipping containers worth of stock. So what we are bringing over, we want to make sure that we're engaging with the right audience and sharing whiskey as well. You know, I'm sure we all like to collect our whiskey, as do we. But I think the great thing with Fable is it's still at a price point and a style that you want to be able to share it with friends and have that sort of unique bottle in your collection that we think Fable ticks that box. So I know Craig shared some of the links in the chat and has kindly put a nice little discount code off there. It's not
every
must be feeling very generous.
every tasting they get usually it's about 10% off. So every tasting into, but the one thing that we find is that, as I said before, is a lot of people don't bother coming on the tasting tonight and then they watch the video over the weekend. So try to kind of spread the code over the weekend as people, you know, maybe were at the football or watching the football, or they did something and they just want to catch up on it. We get a lot of emails the following morning. Where's the video? And I want to watch the video. So try to keep that code going. But I think with a lot of the whiskies we do, when you get the whiskey in front of you, you tend to enjoy it more and go back to it again and think, oh, I'm going to explore that more. So it's really good to get a bottle, you know, and at least one bottle from a tasting, and it's good, you know, it's really, really good. It's actually a good question there. Was Ranjan was saying, what was it about sherry whiskies? Do you think that will be in the next output? Like, will there be you've done all bourbon, ex-bourbon barrel?
I think we should definitely chuck a couple in. I mean, there's a couple of distilleries in particular I'd love to see how we can enhance them with sherry, but maybe not in the kind of standard way. You know, not everything going into the same type of sherry and things. And I've still got some really good contacts. I mean, I'm still in touch with Stuart McPherson, the guy I mentioned. He's just retired earlier this year, and I'm still in touch with him. I'm still in touch with all the Coopers that I've met over the years and the bodegas and things. So we can get access to great sherry casks, and we don't need many because we're not a big operation. You know, we're a small independent bottler, so we can get our hands on what we need for sure. I'd love to have a few of them in sherry, but not all of them. I think there's a couple of them I'd actually just like to blast them with a really active first fill bourbon barrel and get all that vanilla richness and creaminess and things, and just really enhance that as well. So we'll see. But yes is the answer. Definitely,
right.
I'd love to. Yeah.
Thanks for your time. Been wonderful. Got some great background there. That's really good to learn more about it in the future. It would be fantastic. And if you're ever coming over, we'd love to have you here and take you around and do some tasting classes face to face with some customers there as well.
That would be great. Definitely. Well,
perhaps
wait
come
for
out
the
in summer.
Work it out.
I'll see if I can get it signed off by the powers above. I might need to sell a few more bottles of whiskey yet. But you know, it's been really great. I know when we discussed launching Fable in Australia very early on in the brand's inception, when we were launching it in the UK, and it was a very quick conversation because, you know, Daz has got global experience with numerous whiskey companies, so knows the Australian whiskey market incredibly well. I'd lived in Melbourne for close to 6-7 years, and then one of the founders of Fable, co-founders, Callum, has spent a lot of time over in Australia as well. So we were very confident and very reassured that we know Australia is going to be one of our most exciting markets. We've just been hit and delayed by a lot of brands have been with shipping and timings and so on, because we should have realistically almost had our third shipment by this time, but our second shipment's just on the water as of last week. But, you know, we'll get there. This is not, you know, this is a marathon. We're going to be around for a long time. We're not this isn't just going to be a flash in the pan. Like, the guys are heavily invested in building Fable. And I think the really exciting aspects of Fable is how much it can change and be creative. So we've got a lot of different plans in the pipeline to keep our whiskey consumers engaged. So watch this space, as they say.
Sounds good. Thanks for your time as well. It's been wonderful. I think you were on I think start of COVID, the COVID thing, doing Japanese whiskey, and you came up in the world, I would say.
yeah. I mean, it's obviously been a crazy time. Me and Daz would be very much more, our natural habitat would be in a room filled with whiskey and about 100 people. So definitely been a lot more tech savvy in the last 2 years. Has definitely add that to the CV.
Totally, that's it, man. 100%. No, and then for the guys obviously watching this back on the recorded version as well, feel free to just sort of blast away some questions at Fable Whisky. And they can also come to you, Craig, as well, and you can pass them on to us too. So feel free to blast away.
Yeah, I've shared Daz's social media. I've shared also, he runs a great podcast with a good friend of ours, which is really good listen. It's not like another whiskey podcast, hence the name. It's really fun. It's very conversationalist. The guys share some incredible stories. So for those of you that are stuck in your usual Melbourne and Sydney traffic, give it a listen in the morning. But Daz, I really appreciate you logging on. I know you've got a full day ahead of you later on today. But if anyone in the session has any questions, or over the weekend, Craig, just feel free to direct them to myself and Daz, and we'll answer any questions. Full transparency, as we always say, Daz. No, we're not hiding anything. Yeah,
nothing to hide.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just good, tasty whiskey.
That's it.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Well, thanks very much. To let everybody know, we're going to be doing next month, it's Lindores. We're going to be going from the distillery. We've got the Australian importer into Australia, actually at the distillery over in Scotland, and going to be taking us around Lindores distillery. So that was one of the first places, the first place in Scotland where whiskey was distilled many years ago, and we'll go through the history and also some of the whiskies they've got to offer. In the following month in November, we're going to Bimber, in England, and we're going to take a look through their distillery and also take a look at 6 of their whiskies as well. So some exciting stuff coming up, as well as some Aussie distilleries will be coming up as well. Possibly Cape Byron online as well. We'll get to taste their stuff. So stay tuned, stay in touch with us. And yeah, if there's anything that we've not got coming in and you need, like whiskey wise, get in touch and we'll try and get it in for you. And see what we can do. But thanks, Daz. Thanks, Kev. Wonderful.
Yeah,
Hey,
no,
guys.
Daz, I'll make sure I get a sample bottle of the Cape Byron Jim McEwen's whiskey across here. I know you'd really enjoy it, and one for the guys in the office. So yeah,
Be mega brilliant. All right, guys, have a great night. All right, all the best.
Thanks, everyone.
cheers, Daz. Thanks, guys. Thanks,
Cheers.
Craig. Great
Bye.
job as usual. Thank you. Talk
Cheers.
soon.